Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. And by my calculations, this begins the 40th semester of the Malcolm Renfrew Colloquium, which began in September of 2001. This semester will conclude 20 years, and we've been thrilled at the quality and quantity of programs over the years. This is a weekly series of presentations by faculty members, graduate students, visiting scholars, postdocs, undergrads and graduate students over the years. And delighted to have Professor Russ Meeuf from the School of Journalism and Mass Media to kick off the semester. But before introducing him, I'd like to extend a special welcome to students in INTR 450, the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. It's a one credit pass-fail undergraduate class, and we still have room for 3 more students to join. If you are interested, please email me. It is a great way to learn about the diversity of scholarship and teaching and outreach activities across the University of Idaho. And this Thursday, the 21st, is the last day to add a class online. Thursday, the 21st, is also the keynote address for the University of Idaho's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. And it's part of the Black Lives Matter Speaker Series. Edward Onatchi, Associate Professor of History at Ursinus College in Pennsylvania, will be speaking via Zoom. This program begins at 5 o'clock in our time zone, and registration is required. I realize my slide is showing that a tiny URL in fairly faint font. Probably your best bet is to just email oma@uidaho.edu to get the details on that. Next week's program will feature Shelley and Mark McGuire, who will present some of their ongoing research about studying SARS-CoV transmission via breastfeeding during the pandemic. That will be 12:30 on Tuesday, the 26th. It will be at the same Zoom address that you found today's meeting. So hope you will tune in for that. But today, as we're sandwiched between Martin Luther King Day on Monday and the presidential inauguration on Wednesday, which seems an appropriate time to look at how the U.S. horror film has portrayed racial resentment and how Americans, through their viewing of television and film, have reflected and have been exposed to some different ideas on the theme of white terror. And our presenter today is Russ Meeuf, Associate Professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Media, and also Director of our program in Film Studies. And I'm going to close my presentation, and I'll bring up Russ's here.
And while Kenton's doing that, I'm just going to start with a shout out and a thanks to to Kenton for hosting us hosting me in the colloquium, and a big thanks to my colleague Ben James, who I think is in the house today. Ben and I started this project together and kind of conceived of it together, and then he was sadly pulled away with some of his own projects, appropriately enough, writing and directing a horror film. So I pressed on without him for much of this, but this is certainly kind of born of our discussions around horror. So I'm glad Ben could be here so we could talk about this stuff. So, all right, that looks perfect, Kenton. Thank you. All right, so as Kenton said, my name is Russ Meeuf. I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Media, and I want to talk to you a little bit about horror and racial resentment. So In the first years of the Trump presidency, activists and critics turned to the imagery of horror to encapsulate what was to them the nightmare of a President Trump. Chicago artist Mitch O'Connell, for example, began creating and circulating images of Trump in the style of the secret alien overlords from John Carpenter's They Live, among other Trump-related horror memes that made the round on social media. At the same time, a series of overtly political horror stories reinforced the idea that horror would become a key site of political critique in the Trump era. Jordan Peele's Get Out scored several rare Oscar nominations for a horror film by addressing the terror of white liberalism's racial condescension, and won Peele the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. Meanwhile, the 7th season of the horror anthology TV program American Horror Story addressed Trump directly, focusing on a Trump-inspired extremist cult seeking to consolidate political power in a small town in Michigan. These and other stories demonstrated the appetite for critical, politically aware horror stories. For many Americans, then, the spectacle of horror became a fitting lens through which to view the political realities of a blustering, often vulgar president who embraced deception and race baiting. As the Trump presidency became mired in a seemingly never-ending series of scandals and crass tweets, the grim and unsettling worldview of horror mirrored our eroding political norms. American politics has, of course, long abandoned any pretense of real civil discourse, but for many people, the ascendancy of Trump created a horrific bizarro world. Ideal political norms, even if rarely achieved, were turned on their heads. Policy debates were replaced with bluster. Careful analysis was replaced with the so-called alternative facts. The rhetoric of respect gave way to explicit xenophobia and sexism. In the age of Trump, US political culture didn't even pretend to valorize traditional norms, casting aside the veil of tradition and revealing it to be a farce, behind which stood only opportunism, corruption, and hate. And so the uncanny media coverage of a president who is anything but presidential lent itself very well to the uncanny world of horror, where everything that should be life-affirming, family, home, religion, social institutions, are actually grim inversions of their ideal forms, decaying, immoral, and marked by death. So we can go to the next slide there, Kenton. So scholars such as Robin Wood, however, are very careful to note the core ambivalence of horror. In particular historical moments, horror may provide a grotesque spectacle that challenges our social norms, but horror also affirms the core fears of the powerful, that others are lurking around every corner, attempting to dismantle traditional institutions, for example. So while some horror may critically explore the Trumpian nightmare envisioned by the political left, popular horror in the US has always been more than willing to explore the fears of the white US mainstream that helped propel Trump to office in 2016. Fears of outsiders disrupting the sanctity of the almost always white family, fears of evil forces or transgressive ideas transforming loved ones, fears of young people turning against the traditions of older generations, or fears that the world and its technology are just moving too fast. As a popular genre, horror bends just as much to conservative fears around a changing world as it does to a liberal critique of social power. Mainstream horror, in fact, mostly operates somewhere in the kind of the gory middle of these two trends, mirroring the often contradictory fears of a deeply divided and changing culture in a given historical moment. So while our present and our future may be a golden age for critical horror exploring a nightmare of conservative politics, this project looks back at the horror we deserved in the lead up to the election of Trump in 2016. What fears dominated the horror of the Obama era? What major cycles or trends proliferated in the horror film? And how did these films reflect the cultural fears that would lead to slightly less than half of the voting public, but a majority of the Electoral College, to cast their vote for a candidate who so openly embodied xenophobia and sexism? So we'll be kind of looking back at the horror of that era. All right, next slide, Kendon. All right, Euro-American horror, after all, doesn't simply offer a meditation on death and the body. It provides a meditation on death from the vantage of those with relative power and privilege, most often from the vantage of whiteness. Whiteness, after all, has been at the core of the Euro-American horror storytelling since its inception. The 18th and 19th century Gothic tradition that still informs horror today centers on white people in a historical colonial moment, reacting with terror to cultural, economic, and technological change. As the Industrial Revolution and mass culture began to transform day-to-day life in the UK and then the US, Gothic literature dramatized the tension of this tumultuous process. Gothic storytelling from this period featured uncanny supernaturalism with haunted castles, spirits and ghosts, and Machiavellian villains, all in an era of increasing rationality and secularism. Such tales inevitably focused on the fears of privileged whites, largely the withering family trees of old nobility, who discovered that even in an age of so-called progress, the horrific past continues to impinge on the present. These fears would only magnify in the deeply racialized context of the US, where the colonization of indigenous lands and the brutal exploitation of Black, Latinx, and Asian labor has provided the economic foundation for white prosperity. These racial preoccupations have spawned the modern horror film in the US and Europe, centering whiteness and the racial fears of whites in these cinematic traditions. Mainstream US horror cinema fundamentally poses questions about the boundaries and significance of whiteness in the modern world, especially today. So what I want to argue then is that the US horror film is not simply an incidentally white genre produced by a predominantly white film industry, but rather a genre which at its core addresses the intrinsic fears of whiteness in traditionally white supremacist cultures. Despite the popular assertions that horror stories tap into somehow universal fears built into all of human experience, the fears explored in most horror stories, and especially US horror stories, reflect the fears of those with just enough social power and prestige that they might be afraid of losing it. In the context of the US, this tends to mean middle-class white people. And this isn't to ignore that people of color in the US have long embraced the horror film, both as audiences and as filmmakers who have reimagined the white horror tradition. And I'm not wanting to ignore the kind of the varied and vibrant global horror cinemas that have emerged, especially after World War II in places like Japan and South Korea and Nigeria and many others. But I do want to point out how white US horror storytelling is. So if you can go to the next slide, Kenton. Right, so as a storytelling tradition, contemporary US horror continues to be dominated by the trials and tribulations of middle-class white folks. So this slide here shows the 147 mainstream US horror films that I'm looking at in this project, released between 2008 and 2016. And I'll talk in a minute about how I came up with that sample. But out of those 147, we do see a respectable 61, about 42%, that feature people of color in significant roles. Go to the next slide, Kenton. But only 11 of those films actually featured people of color as central character in lead roles, like a measly 7.4%. So this shows that the trope of the ethnic side character who dies early in the narrative is still alive and well in this period of horror filmmaking. And of those 11 films with lead characters of color, 3 were parodies of horror filmmaking, right? Meet the Blacks from 2016, Boo, A Medea Halloween, also from 2016, and the New Zealand-US co-production What We Do in the Shadows from 2014. Another 3 of those 11 featured mixed race or Latinx actors known for playing white or ambiguously ethnic characters in roles without any significant reference to their characters' race or ethnicities. And so I'm considering this Jay Hernandez in Quarantine from 2008, Jessica Alba in The Eye, also from 2008, and Jesse Williams' role in The Cabin in the Woods in 2012. So if you go to the next one, Kenton. So if we pull out those films, that leaves a total of 5 serious horror films between 2008 and 2016 that really and clearly center on people of color, representing only 3.4% of all of the films produced. So when it comes to telling horror stories in the US, we still primarily tell stories about terrified white people for a variety of industrial and cultural reasons. All right, so what I want to argue then is that in the Obama era, the US horror film explored not just a general fear of the other, but the very fears of what whiteness has become, especially in this kind of so-called post-racial era. While the election of the nation's first Black president warranted a wave of celebratory discussions of a possible post-racial America, a steady stream of racist vitriol against Obama and the First Lady made clear that race and racism had not suddenly disappeared from the US. Racial discomfort with the president, of course, found its most public manifestation in the so-called birther movement, which insisted that Obama was actually born in Kenya, but used fake documents to demonstrate that he was born in Hawaii. The birther conspiracy theory found its most vocal supporter in then reality TV star Donald Trump, who used the issue to insert himself via racially inflammatory language into US political discourse. All the while, fueled by right-wing media, many Americans came to believe that Obama's policies and politics put minorities first over white folks, especially rural white folks. While these narratives of supposed white victimization in a politically correct world had festered for decades, the election of Obama provided a high-profile affirmation of that worldview. And the economic recession following the housing crisis of 2006 and 2007 only exacerbated the fears of white folks in the US. Despite the fact that the so-called Great Recession impacted people of color with far more severity, the fate of middle-class whites became a source of national concern in the media as the typical lifelines to middle-class life, home ownership, stable employment, and a college education became more and more inaccessible to the white middle classes, or at least was perceived to be more and more accessible. Politically then, the racial resentments of white folks began to reshape US politics. As Michael Tesler has meticulously documented with data from a range of public opinion surveys, the Obama era in the US was not the post-racial haven forecasted by pundits in the wake of Obama's election, but rather a most racial political era where racially liberal and racially conservative Americans were more divided over a whole host of political positions than they had been in modern times. And I can't recommend enough Michael Tesler's book about this, which is called Post-Racial or Most Racial. So I'm stealing his title for my slide there. All right, so next one, Kenton. So these resentments find themselves reflected in the Obama era horror film, which explores the basis of white guilt and the historical terrors that underpin white prosperity. So the conclusions I'm drawing here are based on an exhaustive analysis of every major US horror film produced between 2008 and 2016. In order to analyze the scope of mainstream horror in this period, I created a list of all US horror films using data from the Internet Movie Database that met the following criteria. So films with the release date between January 1st, 2008 and December 31st, 2016. Films that were tagged as horror in IMDb, and this is where the methodology gets a little tricky because I think people who pay close attention will know that the genre tagging in IMDb is not always wholly reliable. And so there's certainly some films that aren't necessarily in the sample that maybe could have been, but they just were tagged more as thrillers instead of horror films. But I think it provides a good kind of representation of the overall trends. So I was also looking at films produced by a US company, including international co-productions, at least in which at least one US company is involved, and films that grossed at least $1 million in a theatrical release, adjusted for inflation based on the value of the dollar in 2016. So $1 million sounds kind of like a lot of money to you and I, but a film that makes $1 million in theatrical release in the US is actually a pretty low performing film. So it goes pretty far down the food chain of different types of films there. And obviously some of the big limitations are that this doesn't include kind of the really kind of resurgence of television horror that's happening, or a lot of the kind of really interesting films that went straight to streaming in this period that were horror based. So it's just looking at theatrical released horror films. But again, I think that creates a kind of a good representative sample. So the result is a list of 147 films across a 9-year period that reflect the core of mainstream horror. So we can go to the next one, Kenton. So within these 147 films, I looked for the significant cycles and trends that characterize the genre. Each film was categorized into a series of subgenres, hybrid genres, or themes. For example, haunted house or action horror or horrific technology, yielding a total of 27 different subcategories of horror that indicate the variety and complexity of horror storytelling. And I should say that because horror storytelling tends to be kind of multifaceted and combines different genre elements, each of the 147 films could fit into up to 3 categories as I was coding my data. So for example, the 2012 film Sinister, I counted as a haunted house narrative, and that it uses the genre of the haunted house, but it also features significant images of horrific children and horrific technology. So when we talk about the trends, we're talking about films that exhibit one of these patterns rather than just has to fit fully into it. And to make historical comparisons, I repeated this entire process for the horror genre between 1980 and 2007, tracking the persistence of different subgenres and hybrid genres in that 28-year period. So if we can go to the next one, Kenton. All right. So as a result of these historical comparisons, I've identified what I think are not only the most prevalent kinds of horror stories in the Obama years, but also the stories that are historically unique to it. So cycles of films that didn't seem to resonate in the 1980s, 1990s, or early 2000s, but have become the staple narratives of horror from 2008 to 2016. Many of these cycles are very old horror tropes that have become resurgent lately, such as the haunted house film. Other cycles are relatively new, such as the trend towards horror remakes that began in the mid 2000s. So based on this research, what I identified as the most significant cycles were the haunted house film, the home invasion film, the possession and exorcism film, which I'll talk about in detail today, the horrific child film, the horrific technology film, and the nostalgic horror remake. And so these are all kind of really powerful cycles that are kind of unique to the Obama era in terms of their popularity. So if we can go to the next one, Kenton. So these Obama era cycles all highlight the horror film's focus on whiteness, offering a variety of narratives often on the same theme, the supposed declining fortunes of white folks in an era of white guilt and perceived white victimization. So for example, a major cycle of haunted house films would dominate the Obama era horror film. In the wake of the housing crisis in the mid 2000s, the home, and in particular the white family home, became one of the most popular settings of the horror film. Between 2008 and 2016, Hollywood produced a whopping 32 films with a significant haunted house element, around 3.5 films every year of the Obama era. And that accounted for about 20% of all mainstream US horror films in that period were featuring haunted houses, which was a huge increase from horror filmmaking in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. These contemporary haunted house narratives pay particular attention to issues of whiteness and social class. Across the Obama era haunted house film, white families are haunted not only by ghosts, demons, aliens, and other supernatural entities, but also by the nagging fear that they have lost their privileged social standing in a changing economy. Home ownership, once a key lifeline in the quest for middle class standing, instead becomes an anchor, dragging once wholesome families into poverty, and even worse for white families in the US, low social class. So we see across these films a real concern with the kind of the class standing of the families depicted here. We can go to the next one. I chose to talk about the possession film today, in particular the ways that it kind of engages with issues of kind of white masculinity and white male authority. And I think as I'll get going, hopefully you'll see why I chose this, because I think it's kind of timely with what we're talking about right now. So as I said, I want to look closely at the increase in possession and exorcism films in the Obama era. Films in which someone, usually a child or a young woman, becomes possessed by an unknown entity requiring the intervention of a usually white male protagonist. These narratives proliferated in mainstream US horror in the Obama era. Possession and exorcism films were scant in the 90s and early 2000s, with only 3 produced between 1992 and 1999, which was about 3% of all mainstream horror in that period. And then another 3 between 2000 and 2008, which was about 2% of the mainstream horror in that period. But starting in 2009, Hollywood produced 16 films with a significant possession and exorcism storyline, representing 10% of all mainstream horror films from 2008 to 2016. These films included standard Catholic exorcism narratives in films like The Rite, The Devil Inside, and The Vatican Tapes. It also included an evangelical exorcism depicted in The Last Exorcism, and several Jewish exorcism stories in The Unborn and The Possession. This period also saw several genre mashups, like the police procedural exorcism film Deliver Us from Evil, which is monumentally bad, but really interesting to watch for how bad it is. And then also there's a kind of Inception-inspired dream world exorcisms in a film called Incarnate. And as I'll talk about in a minute, there's the highly successful blending of haunted houses and possessions in the popular Insidious franchise, which also disrupted the usual focus on the male occult expert by using the character of Elise Rainier, who one of my favorites. All right, next slide, Kenton. All right, so behind the story of a possessed female in the possession film is always the story of a man in crisis. In these stories, the salvation of the innocent victim, tempted and possessed by an evil entity, is simply an opportunity for the male exorcist to overcome some kind of personal crisis and find the strength and moral certitude to conduct the exorcism. These narrative trends owe much to the success of the 1973 film The Exorcist. William Friedkin's classic film established the key themes and narrative devices of the possession film, from the priest nagged by self-doubt to the implication that women and children are particularly susceptible to demonic possession, especially in times of personal crisis. The Exorcist's concern with authority, faith, and generational conflict resonated with the cultural context of the 1970s. Historian Sean Quinlan and our class dean has analyzed the Exorcist novel alongside popular books turned movies such as Rosemary's Baby and The Omen, identifying a cycle of demonic and satanic stories in popular culture in the 70s that expressed a deep sense of generational mistrust in the wake of the youth counterculture. These generational conflicts, moreover, signaled a larger loss of faith in the US culture in the 70s, with both scientific institutions as well as religious institutions. For Quinlan, these stories explored a world in which the authority of science and medicine, coupled with declining faith in the US, generated an acute ennui concerning traditional forms of authority. These concerns are also taken up by Carol Clover in her foundational work, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is an excellent book. I recommend everybody. Clover argues that possession stories in the 70s and early 80s negotiated the changing meanings of manhood during the second wave of the feminist movement. For Clover, possession films dramatized the tension between cold, rational masculine science and feminized emotional spirituality. As the female body in the possession film becomes abject and horrific, the overly rigid masculinity of the male protagonist must reject the dictates of traditional manhood and become more open to emotionality, intuition, and implicitly homoeroticism. Reflecting the new man discourses of the post-Vietnam era, the possession films of the 70s and 80s transformed tough and terse men into more sensitive and emotional people, opening up to the possibilities of the supernatural, but not opening up too much because the extreme openness of women and femininity in general made them ripe for demonic possession in the first place. So we see in the 70s and 80s this kind of interesting gendered negotiation happening about men being too rigid and needing to kind of open themselves up. So we can go to the next one. The Obama-era resurgence in possession stories also espouses the need for men to open up and embrace the supernatural. However, rather than yielding an introspective look at the horrors of hardened manhood, more recent possession stories suggest that embracing faith in the supernatural will help downtrodden white men reclaim the cultural authority that they have supposedly lost. These films engage with many of the same cultural tensions as earlier possession films, such as intergenerational conflict. Newer generations, such as millennials and Gen Z, have become a source of anxiety for older Americans as they enter into adulthoods and positions of power, for example. At the same time, science and medicine have become increasingly political in the Obama era, from debates around climate change to the dangers of vaccines to the quality of healthcare in America. Thanks in part to a concerted effort by conservative politicians and other groups, the perceived value of science and education in general is now closely tied to political affiliation. In the Obama years, these crises in traditional authorities were often grafted onto a perceived crisis in white masculinity. Failures of traditional institutions such as education or science, from this perspective, stemmed from the dictates of so-called political correctness within those institutions. As secular institutions became more diverse, those institutions became suspect. Meanwhile, institutions that still largely centered white manhood, churches, saw their faith in male authority repaid by sex scandals and other abuses of power. And the declining economic status of working class men was perhaps the most visible icon of Obama-era masculinity crises. Media commentators quickly promoted the idea of a so-called man session, right? The idea that the Great Recession impacted male workers more severely than female workers. The perceived economic anxieties of the white working class male bolstered a larger and pervasive narrative of white decline, especially the idea that white men are victims in a more diverse and politically correct age. And it's important to note here that we're talking about a media discourse around white male anxiety, which is much different than a reality of economic anxiety. In fact, I think today we see that these kind of discourses around economic hardship and the idea of the so-called forgotten man are often used as a cover by economically prosperous white folks wanting to express racial resentment and perceptions of white victimization, as we saw with the recent insurrection at the Capitol that was not being driven by economically precarious white folks, but rather fairly economically stable white folks. All right, next slide, Kenton. So against this backdrop, the Obama-era possession film explored a series of similar concerns about the supposed decline of white male authority. Film after film focused on a downtrodden white man, once in authority, but now in doubt, who uses an exorcism to reaffirm his manhood and show that his authority is righteous. So in The Possession, a divorced basketball coach struggling with economic precarity, who's lost the respect of his family, redeems himself by saving his youngest daughter from a Jewish demon. In Mirrors, a former police officer is separated from his family after being tossed from the force and struggling with addiction, redeems himself by squaring off with demons inhabiting occult mirrors that possess those who gaze into them. In Incarnate, a doctor, now a disreputable scientist, uses supernatural powers to evict demons from the minds of possessed people, all while he hunts down the demon who killed his family. And we also see several narratives of declining faith used as metaphors for a loss of male authority in films like The Last Exorcism, in which a pastor who acknowledges that his exorcisms are fake is documenting kind of one last job that turns out to be real, or The Rite, in which a young priest from a working class community has kind of lost his faith and must reevaluate by assisting an experienced exorcist in Rome. All right. Next slide. I think the 2010 film Insidious demonstrates the genre's obsession with resuscitating white manhood pretty clearly, even though it does offer some really kind of clever genre variations. In this film, we're getting introduced to a family. It seems like a kind of a standard haunted house narrative where they move into a new home. He's a school teacher. His stay-at-home wife partner is trying to resuscitate her career as a pianist. And we start seeing these strange apparitions around the house, especially after one of their sons takes a fall and slips into a mysterious coma. So the family starts breaking apart, and but they realize that it's in a famous line from the film that it's not their house that's haunted, but rather their son. And they discover a deep family secret. That the father himself was an accomplished astral projector who was able to explore the spirit world that they call the further. But he was being tormented by a demon who wanted to possess him, and so he was hypnotized by Elise Rainier, a clairvoyant, into forgetting that he had those powers. But he's passed them on to his son, who is now has been kidnapped and being held hostage in the further. Now we can kind of move forward, Kenton. Go to the next one, actually. All right, so while Elise Rainier in these films provides the secret knowledge that can save Dalton, in Insidious, ultimately men must literally reclaim their lost powers in order to revive the struggling nuclear family. Because of the emasculating threat of the bride in black, Josh was forced to repress his natural gifts, and while that allowed him to lead a seemingly normal life, his powers must be restored to face off with the evils that haunted his family. That his mother, helped by a female occult expert, hypnotized Josh in the past into forgetting his powers, only accentuates his emasculation. Although well-meaning, the hypnotism he underwent as a child is hindering the adult Josh from fulfilling his promise as a man. He is still living under the protective spell of his mother and Elise Rainier, and only escape from that protection will provide the opportunity for him to man up, as it were. Okay. These are also really very clear in the sequel, but I'll save that for another time. So next one, Kenton. So for the white men in the Obama-era possession film like Josh in Insidious, accepting the realities of the supernatural means accepting an intractable vision of moral clarity. The films present a world of uncertainty, and the only way to find stability for unmoored white men is to accept an inflexible view of good and evil. There are evil entities in the world that the mainstream won't accept, but men must step up to protect their families. So today's exorcism and possession films posit the need for everyone to practice constant vigilance in the face of pervasive evil. This vision of constant, inescapable evil is both horrifying and reassuring. it reimagines, or it imagines a dark world that requires discipline and a willingness to see the signifiers of evil that the mainstream ignores. But it also imagines a world where everyday people can be significant actors in an epic struggle with clear boundaries between good and evil. The world may be dark, but if you're willing to see the signs, then the solutions are clear. So this unflinching worldview mirrors the logic of right-wing media commentary throughout the Obama era. And I think if we go to the next slide, is we can see a kind of a direct line from the logic of the exorcism film to the logic of the recent insurrection at the nation's capital. White men who see themselves as victims vehemently rejected the conclusions of mainstream experts in favor of a horrific worldview in which an evil entity is trying to possess our sacred institutions. Like the men in the possession film, these men here took things into their own hands in order to try to play out their fears around white victimization. So I think we can kind of unfortunately see that same kind of logic around kind of a moral polarity in the world that only these these men in particular who reject mainstream teachings can really kind of embrace. So next one. I do want to call out a couple of films that I think are particularly interesting in adding some complexities to what we see overall in the possession film. In particular, The Last Exorcism Part 2, which I know it's really weird to have a movie called The Last Exorcism Part 2. Doesn't make any sense, but from 2013, and The Witch. Which both provide these very similar narratives exploring patriarchy and its obsessions with controlling young women. In The Last Exorcism Part 2, the young woman from the first film has managed to escape the demon, but finds her way to New Orleans and is still being stalked by it. And she finds a group of occult experts who offer to help, but it becomes clear that those folks would much rather murder her than allow her to become possessed. We see kind of a similar story of persecution in The Witch, about a young woman beset by evil forces and by those who want to help her. Living in an isolated cabin with her family in Puritan-era New England, a teenage girl is suspected of witchcraft by her devout family, but as mysterious events unfold in her household, her parents become increasingly aggressive, imprisoning her and eventually trying to murder her. In both films, though, we see the young women at their center decide to embrace demons and embrace Satan and embrace evil rather than choosing the oppressive forces of patriarchy. They both end with scenes of women's power and pleasure, reveling in the freedoms and ecstasy of young women who suddenly find themselves extricated from patriarchal control. Not to spoil it, but in The Last Exorcism Part 2, she decides, you know what, maybe the demon's not so bad if the people trying to help me are that much worse. And at the end, she's literally burning New Orleans to the ground, laughing gleefully at her newfound powers. And in The Witch, for those of you who've seen it, she ends up by embracing the deal offered to her by Satan in the form of Black Phillip the Goat, and is seen at the end levitating nude with a coven of witches and taking kind of pleasure in that. So given the rigid moral vision across most of the Obama-era possession films, these endings provide a rather powerful challenge to the dominant narrative trends, suggesting that maybe it would be better and certainly more fun to just let the world of white patriarchy burn to the ground in a frenzy of female laughter and pleasure. But of course, neither film performed particularly well at the box office, even though The Witch was a critical hit. And it seems that the moral clarity of the Insidious films, with their insistence on white patriarchal authority, seemed to resonate much more in the Obama years. And with that, we'll see if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Russ, for that informative and provocative presentation. And I'm going to stop the share so that we can see all of the participants. And we have a couple of excellent questions already in the chat. And so we'll start with Johanna, who asks, did your research yield any generic intersections between horror and conspiracy? It strikes me that QAnon adheres to many of the features of the Obama era horror that you've identified, as well as anchored in centuries old anti-Semitic mythologies and superstitions. So overlap between horror and conspiracy. You want to tackle that one?
Yeah, and I think Yes, I think actually, was particularly looking at the kind of the films I was looking at and the era I was looking at. The role of the kind of occult expert in a lot of horror films is very explicitly cast as this kind of in the same kind of logic and vision of kind of conspiracy theories and kind of the delving beneath the surface, right? This idea that mainstream knowledge won't help you with anything, but if you know the right places to look. I think in one of my other chapters I talk a lot about a film called Dark Skies, which is a really weird and interesting haunted house film that's actually about aliens, right? They're being haunted by these aliens, and it's very explicitly, right, they go online to seek out an occult expert who can help them decipher the clues all around them that lead them to the recognition that they are being targeted, right, but by the Greys, right? This type of alien that is featuring them. So I think while we don't see a lot of explicit kind of like QAnon references, particularly in this period, we do see that conspiracy logic is very much a driving logic in the kind of the vision of many of the occult experts that we see in horror films.
And I was thinking really about how birther evolved into QAnon.
Mm-hmm.
And birther as like the original Obama era conspiracy theory. But I think thinking about the movies where there's a sort of a cult expert that comes in to like the Bly, and these are more recent, so they're not part of your period, but the haunting of Bly and the haunting of all these, and how the occult expert has to come in and intervene. And this new show, The Outsider, which I recently watched, which is based on a Stephen King, but has a similar contrast between a Black woman expert occultist and a white male cop in this contrast. Thank you.
Yeah.
Russ, Sky is wondering, you've discussed an unusually pervasive racism and sexism in this genre. Does horror tend to accentuate any other biases?
That's a great question. Although I don't know if it's unusually pervasive for mainstream U.S. cinema. I think it's more just kind of identifying it. But this question kind of speaks to a core debate within people who study horror, and that's thinking about the capacity of horror to kind of make ideological critiques while also still reinforcing kind of really problematic stereotypes and problematic assumptions about the world. And that a lot of folks would argue that horror is really, really well suited towards different types of critiques around racism and sexism. That, Robin Wood writes about this idea that we create these monsters, but what those monsters do is allow things that we're not supposed to look at, allow the repressed to kind of be expressed, and often in a way that dismantles some of our kind of core assumption, kind of bourgeois assumptions about the world around us. And so I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that all horror is kind of unusually racist and sexist. I think though what Robin Wood talks about is kind of these kind of cycles where we start seeing where horror sometimes is more critical and sometimes becomes much more reactionary, which is I think true of a lot of genre cycles. And I think, horror tends to accentuate a lot of other biases. I mean, I think particularly one of the things that I don't talk a lot about, but I think is really, really important with horror is thinking about issues around disability and the body, and issues of sexuality, trans identity. I think, as a genre that's really, really, keyed into thinking about kind of our social norms around death, around the body. Horror is oftentimes really kind of putting its finger on the pulse of kind of what's happening in the culture around our kind of anxieties around those issues as well.
Brittany asks, could those last two examples, and that would be from the slide Complications and Resistance, could they also depict a condemnation of female power and pleasure by associating them with evil? That is, if left to their own devices, women will choose evil. The imagery seemed less about overcoming patriarchy than reinforcing the need for it. So the two films that you showed the images of at the very end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a viable way of looking at those films as well, right? And I think they're largely outliers to the overall trend that we see. So I think you could certainly push it in that direction. I think particularly in the possession and exorcism film, there is a kind of an inherent assumption that women and children are potentially more apt to be possessed and more apt to be tempted by evil than kind of their male counterparts. And so I think you can certainly look at those films and say, oh yeah, right, this is really just about kind of indulging, that tendency as well. I think that the films and their endings are a little bit more complicated than that. I think that they go out of their way to demonstrate the kind of the horrors of the kind of the white patriarchal authority that those women face. I think particularly in The Witch, right? Nobody reads The Witch and thinks like, oh, well, she just had a nice wholesome family and she should have, if she just stuck with them, everything would have been fine, right? It was clear in that narrative context, I think that that alternative of just kind of like embracing patriarchal authority was itself also incredibly horrific. So when those are your choices, you choose the one that lets you levitate in the woods. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? But I agree that it's nuanced and open for interpretation for sure.
Russ, Taryn is wondering if you have watched the HBO adaptation of The Watchmen, and if so, do you think a show that tackles a past historical event like Black Wall Street, but made in modern times, will pertain to your study and the theme of this presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, I really liked the recent Watchmen adaptation, sequel, whatever it is. I think, yeah, it's highly relevant. And I would say I'm also working my way through the Lovecraft country, which I think is very explicitly engaging with these types of ideas of what kind of the horror fantasy genre and how it intersects with issues of kind of race and historical racism. I do talk in my conclusion to this project about what we've seen in the kind of the horror of the Trump years, right? So horror filmmaking past 2016. And I do think, and I think, and I've got the numbers to back this up, right, that we have seen a pretty large increase in horror storytelling that centers the perspective and stories of people of color, and that many of those are really kind of engaging critical texts that are trying to kind of ask harder questions about those relationships. I think one of the things that's interesting, and I do think we see this in Watchmen, is that it still is really keyed into class standing, that a lot of these narratives, even something like Jordan Peele's Get Out and Jordan Peele's Us, are about race and about racism, but also still about middle classness in a particular way. In this case, about middle class people of color or kind of upwardly mobile people of color, wondering if they can still fit into this kind of vision of the world, if they can still inhabit that class standing, or if racism will still kind of be an important factor in their lives. And I think you see that a bit in the Watchmen one as well, even though it's less horror and more its own kind of weird genre thing for people who are familiar with Watchmen.
Bob asked if you can say anything about the writers, producers, directors who made these films and any feedback loops they may have with their audiences. That is, are they just making what sells, or do they have other motives for creating films with these themes?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is a really interesting question for this period, because we start seeing in the kind of the early Obama years the rise of Jason Blum as a producer and Blumhouse Productions, and there is a kind of a cyclical nature to the production cycle, right? That like once a particular vision of horror kind of catches on, it inspires imitators and it creates its kind of own reinforcing cycle. I think you see this with kind of like the early successes of like the Conjuring and Insidious films, that basically after The Conjuring, most horror films now look like The Conjuring and often tell similar stories to The Conjuring. It's kind of inspired an almost kind of particular style, right? Like, so like in particularly like if you look at like Bly Manor and Hill House, the TV shows, for example, they're like very heavy-handedly looking a lot like these kind of models that have come before them. So I do think there are kind of those types of feedback loops, and that producers kind of think like, okay, well, this is the type of story that we need to tell, and this person made a lot of money doing that. Although Blumhouse's model is largely around making kind of glossy but somewhat, lower budget horror, because then you don't have to make as much money on your return on investment. So I think that that's certainly a kind of an economic factor happening in terms of the repetition of these types of stories. And you can see that shift happening, right? In kind of 2008 and 2010, we're still in that period where they're still doing more international remakes, and still kind of trying to figure it out. But then we start seeing early in that period the kind of emergence of a kind of voice, right? A kind of a particular vision of horror that happens there. But that also is a trend that happens all the time, right? That happens in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and before that, right? So there's always these kind of cyclical forces. And so what I'm kind of interested in is which cycles producers and audiences got locked into in this period as being the ones that were most that they saw as most relevant.
This is outside the time frame of your study, but is Birth of a Nation a white terror film? And would this research prompt a reconsideration of the origins of genre and narrative conventions in earlier periods of film history? And that was a question from Johanna.
Yeah, great question, Johanna, right? I love the good film questions too, because Johanna and I both know that like the impact of Birth of a Nation on all of U.S. filmmaking is huge, right? I mean, you're talking Birth of a Nation 1916, not the Birth of a Nation. What was the recent Birth of a Nation film about? There's that other one, but anyway.
That was about Nat Turner's uprising.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that person was kind of discredited and got sort of swept up in the Me Too. So he hasn't been as present. But yeah, I meant the Griffith, and I'm thinking specifically about the sort of formal pioneering, formal stuff that was so integrated with the sort of, and also the Capitol riots resonances with the idea of like a white mob storming and the reception of that film as actually the first film screened in the White House.
Yeah, and I think all of that is really, really important to, not just this project, but all of kind of U.S. filmmaking, right? That there's really great scholarship talking about, Birth of a Nation as the creation of a certain type of kind of racial melodrama that has really been pervasive in a lot of U.S. filmmaking and particularly U.S. genre filmmaking. And so, yeah, I think that that's certainly at play here, right? I mean, you can certainly read Birth of a Nation as its own type of horror film, right? About possession, about, infestation, about these really kind of problematic views of the other kind of infiltrating white institutions. And instituting, again, that kind of melodramatic vision, right? That moral polarity of the world is not as complicated as people seem, but nobody wants to admit how clear it is, right? Like, you can see that logic in the Birth of a Nation and kind of clear through here, right? This idea that if only you listened to, if you ignore the mainstream and you just look at the reality around you, then clearly you can see what the horrible things that are happening, and you just need these kind of extra governmental bodies to step up to handle it. And I think that logic is very, very pervasive in in these films, right? Even if they're not as explicitly, right, as explicit as something like The Birth of a Nation, that core logic, I mean, I think is in many ways the core logic of white power, white supremacy, white privilege.
And this question is outside your geographic scope, but Ivor asked earlier whether the Swedish film Midsommar, I hope I pronounced that close to how the Swedes would, do you consider that to be a horror film? And Ivor describes it as one of the most terrifying films of the last several years. So can we extrapolate from US to Europe and the white fears that as a result of immigration into, particularly into Central and Northern Europe?
Yes, and so we're talking the Midsummer. What year was Midsummer? I'm trying to think here, because that was American director, right? Are we thinking of? I just want to make sure we're talking about the same film. I was pulling up all my stuff here.
2019.
Yeah, so that was the Ari Aster one. Was that co-produced with? I mean, I think that one was one of the. I think I would have categorized that as a. Yeah, so it was a co-produced film between the U.S. and Sweden, which I didn't even realize the Swedes agreed to co-produce something like that, considering it's a horrific film about going into rural Nordic countries and being terrorized. So yeah, I mean, I think we can see in that film again, right, this kind of clear centralizing of whiteness, right? And particularly that the main characters there are largely white, not exclusively, but largely white Americans who are going for this kind of experience of other cultures, right? And kind of in this case using kind of these kind of extreme vision of Nordic folk rituals as kind of this other against which they have to measure. Yeah, you know, Johanna and I have had many conversations about Midsummer, and I feel like years later, I'm still wrapping my head around everything that's happening in that film. But I do think that there's a kind of an international component to this as well. And I did see some of that. That was a much bigger trend in Bush era horror filmmaking, where it was that concern with like Americans abroad and kind of coming into contact with kind of international contamination and horror. But yeah, I think even beyond the scope of US horror, I do think like in particular European horror and other places, there is a similar concern in the horror genre around kind of privilege and class standing as something that needs to kind of get mediated. But we'll have longer conversations about Midsummer another time.
We have time for one more question from Maya, who asks, do you expect to see another shift in horror movie trends as we move into the Biden administration, as we saw a shift from Obama to Trump? As we go from Trump to Biden, are there going to be some different themes that emerge in cinema?
That is a great question, and it kind of speaks to kind of an uncertainty I have, right? I think looking at the period that I'm looking at, that the election of Obama coincides with a large cultural shift in the kind of the discussions we've been having about race and the kind of the rise of racial resentments. I don't know if that was necessarily caused by the election of Obama as much as Obama was kind of a moment in this larger cultural history. And so I think that asks the kind of a historical question about whether or not it's the actual like transitioning of presidential administrations that causes cultural shifts, or whether these cultural shifts just sometimes happen to line up with the changes of presidential administrations in a way that I don't know that they necessarily have in the past. Like, could we identify like the horror of the Jimmy Carter era as a unique trend? I don't think so, right? But I think time will tell. I do think there was still another marked shift with the election of Trump, but I think one that was kind of built on a large kind of cultural swing in the ways that we talked about and acknowledged race. So we'll see. I don't know. Great question.
And there may be a time lag between when a film is made and released and the political and cultural events that inspire it. So it might be a year from now before we would see the first Biden-themed horror films.
Yeah, I don't think anything I'm doing here is predictive. So I'm looking back. So ask me in 4 years.
Well, thank you, Russ, and thank you to the audience for those great questions. Appreciate that. I hope you'll come back next week for something entirely different, looking at COVID transmission via breast milk from Mark and Shelley McGuire. And I'd like to remind students in the INTR 450 class to stick around after we end the official colloquium program. But if those of you in the audience with your cameras off, if you would like to turn them on and give a virtual round of applause, or if you want to do the hand applause in Zoom. And it's been just a great topic to begin the semester, lots to think about. And we look forward to the next chapter of your study of the horror film genre. So thanks, Russ. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the sunshine today and have a great inauguration day tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Russ. Bye-bye.